Your attention is creating your life. You become whatever you repeatedly give your attention to. And you probably don't realize how much of your life is being decided by something as simple as where you look. Not your goals. Not your intentions. Not even your biggest decisions. Your attention. Right now, something has your attention. Maybe this video does. Maybe your phone is sitting beside you. Maybe you are thinking about someone. Maybe there is something bothering you that you promised yourself you wouldn't think about anymore. Maybe you're worried about your future. Maybe you're comparing yourself to somebody. Maybe you're imagining a conversation that hasn't happened yet. And here's the strange part. You didn't necessarily choose any of those thoughts. They simply appeared. But every time you give them your attention, you're feeding them. And what you repeatedly feed gets stronger. Think about that for a moment. Your mind is not just a place where thoughts happen. It is an environment being shaped by whatever you repeatedly allow inside. And that means something uncomfortable. You may be spending years becoming a person you never consciously decided to become. Think about the first thing you usually do when you wake up. Before you've even properly entered the day, you reach for your phone. You open Instagram. You check messages. You watch a few shorts. You see someone's body, someone's relationship, someone's vacation, someone's new car, someone's achievement, someone complaining, someone arguing, someone showing you a life that appears infinitely more interesting than yours. And then you put the phone down. You haven't even left your bed. But somehow, you already feel behind. Nothing happened to you. Nobody directly insulted you. You didn't fail an exam. You didn't lose money. Your life didn't suddenly become worse. But something entered your mind. Comparison. And you gave it attention. Then you go through your day carrying a feeling you can't quite explain. Something is wrong with my life. Where did that thought come from? Maybe nowhere obvious. Maybe it came from the 100 tiny things you looked at that morning. That's the power of attention. It doesn't always change your life dramatically in one moment. It changes what your mind considers normal. Imagine that you walk into a room you've never seen before. There are hundreds of objects inside. A chair, a table, painting, a window, a clock, a plant, a small crack in the wall. You don't consciously notice everything. Your attention selects. Now imagine someone tells you, there is a red object somewhere in this room. Suddenly, you start seeing red. The red book, the red pen, the red cushion, the tiny red mark on the painting. Those things were already there. Your eyes didn't suddenly become better. Your attention simply became tuned to something. And once the mind learns what to look for, it starts finding more of it. This is happening to you all the time. If you spend enough time looking for reasons people don't respect you, you'll find them. If you spend enough time looking for evidence that you're unattractive, you'll find it. If you spend enough time looking for reasons your life is unfair, you'll find them. If you spend enough time looking for things to be afraid of, you'll find those too. The world hasn't necessarily changed. Your filter has. This is why two people can live almost identical lives and experience completely different worlds. One person wakes up and thinks, another day, let's see what happens. Another wakes up thinking, here we go again. Same morning, same sunlight, same city, same traffic, completely different internal worlds. One notices opportunities. The other notices problems. One notices people being kind. The other notices every slight. One notices how much they have. The other notices what they lack. And after years of this, those aren't just temporary moods anymore. They become personalities. They become identities. Eventually the person says, that's just how I am. But maybe that's not how you are. Maybe that's what you've been repeatedly practicing. Your attention is like a path through a forest. The first time you walk somewhere, there is no path. You have to push through the branches. But if you walk the same route every day, the path becomes obvious. Eventually you don't even think about taking it. You just go. Your brain does something similar. Repeated attention creates mental pathways. You repeatedly think about rejection, and rejection becomes easy to notice. You repeatedly think about failure, and failure becomes easy to imagine. You repeatedly think about sex, and everything becomes sexualized. You repeatedly think about money, and everything becomes a financial calculation. You repeatedly think about your appearance, and every mirror becomes a judgment. You repeatedly consume outrage, and the world begins to look like an endless battlefield. You don't have to consciously decide to become cynical. You just have to repeatedly feed your mind cynicism. And this is where modern life becomes strange. You've never had access to more information, and you've never had less control over what enters your mind. Your phone can show you something new every few seconds. A tragedy, a joke, a beautiful person, a war, a political argument, a motivational speech, a shocking headline, a fitness transformation, a relationship failure, a luxury lifestyle, a conspiracy, a celebrity, a stranger screaming, a stranger crying, and then another, and another, and another. Your nervous system doesn't get a clean boundary between what is happening to me and what am I merely watching. Your mind sees it, your body reacts, your attention moves, and suddenly you've spent an hour emotionally living inside the lives of people you've never met. Then you wonder why you feel mentally exhausted. And here's something worth asking yourself. How much of your emotional life belongs to you? How much of what you're angry about actually happened to you? How much of what you're worried about is happening right now? How much of your insecurity came from direct experience? And how much came from comparison? How much of your dissatisfaction existed before you started consuming other people's lives? This isn't about saying social media is evil. It's more subtle than that. The question is, what is it doing to your attention? Because something can be entertaining and still be shaping you. Something can be harmless for 5 minutes and destructive when consumed for 5 hours. The issue isn't always the individual piece of content. It's the pattern. Imagine eating one piece of junk food, probably not a major event. Now imagine every meal you eat is junk food. The problem isn't one burger. It's the diet. Your mind has a diet too. What are you feeding it? What kind of conversations? What kind of videos? What kind of music? What kind of people? What kind of thoughts? What kind of environments? What kind of information? Because eventually, your mental diet becomes your mental atmosphere, and you have to live inside that atmosphere. Maybe you've noticed this with music. You listen to a particular song repeatedly during a difficult period. Months later, you hear it again. Suddenly you're back there. The room, the person, the feeling, the version of yourself you were at that time. Why? Because attention and emotion work together. You weren't merely hearing the song. You were repeatedly attaching attention to an emotional state. Your mind learned the association. This happens with everything. Place, a smell, a photograph, a person's name, a certain type of content, a particular thought. Repeated attention creates familiarity, and familiarity starts feeling like truth. That's why a negative thought you've repeated for years can feel incredibly convincing. Not because it's necessarily accurate, because you've practiced believing it. Maybe your mind tells you, I'm behind. You've heard that voice so many times that it doesn't even sound like a thought anymore. Sounds like reality. I'm not attractive enough. I'll never succeed. Nobody really cares about me. I'm wasting my life. I'm not disciplined. I'm too late. I'm not good enough. But stop for a second. Where did these sentences come from? Who taught them to you? And more importantly, how many times have you repeated them? Because a thought repeated enough times can become an invisible room. You stop questioning it. You simply live inside it. And this is why attention may be more valuable than time. Time passes whether you use it or not. You can waste an hour. You can use an hour. But attention determines what that hour does to you. Two people can spend the same 30 minutes on their phones. One watches educational content and learns something. Another watches outrage and becomes angry. Another watches fitness content and becomes inspired. Another watches luxury lifestyles and becomes insecure. Another watches comedy and relaxes. Same 30 minutes. Different psychological consequences. So the question isn't only, how much time am I spending? Ask, what is my attention becoming while I spend that time? Because you are not simply consuming information. You are training your perception. If you constantly consume content that makes people look perfect, you train yourself to see your own imperfections. If you constantly consume arguments, you train yourself to look for enemies. If you constantly consume fear, you train yourself to scan for threats. If you constantly consume wisdom, you begin noticing patterns. If you consume beauty, you become more sensitive to beauty. If you consume curiosity, you become more curious. If you consume gratitude, you start noticing what is already here. Your attention teaches you what matters. This is why outrage is so powerful. Anger grabs attention. Fear grabs attention. Shock grabs attention. Controversy grabs attention. Your brain is naturally drawn toward things that might represent danger. That made sense when humans needed to notice predators. Today, the predator might be a notification, a headline, comment, a stranger's opinion. The brain doesn't always care whether the threat is physically near you. It simply notices something important is happening, and your attention moves toward it. That's why you can spend 20 minutes reading an argument between strangers while ignoring something important in your own life. You are giving your most valuable mental resource to people who don't even know you exist. Think about how strange that is. And comparison might be even more subtle. You see someone who is ahead of you. Maybe they're richer, better looking, more successful, more confident, more socially skilled, more muscular, more experienced. And your mind immediately creates a conclusion. They are where I should be. But you don't know their entire life. You see the result. You don't see the circumstances. You don't see the failures. You don't see the private struggles. You don't see what they sacrificed. You don't see what they started with. You're comparing your entire behind the scenes to someone else's carefully selected frame. And then you give that comparison your attention. Again, and again, and again. Eventually, you don't even need another person. You can compare yourself against your own imagined ideal. And that can be even worse. You become obsessed with the person you think you should be, the body you should have, the money you should have, the career you should have, the relationship you should have, the personality you should have. And every time you look at yourself, you see the gap. Your attention keeps going toward what's missing. So even when your life improves, you don't experience the improvement because your attention immediately moves to the next deficiency. You get one thing, then you notice what you don't have. You achieve something, then you notice someone who achieved more. You become healthier, then you compare your body. You make progress, then you move the finish line, and eventually you wonder, why does nothing ever feel enough? Maybe because you trained your attention to search for insufficiency. So what do? Do you stop using your phone? Delete every app? Never watch entertainment again? Move into the mountains? No, that's not realistic. And the goal isn't to control every thought. The goal is to become intentional about what repeatedly receives your attention. Start small. For one day, notice. Don't change anything yet. Just notice. When you reach for your phone, ask, what am I looking for? When you open an app, ask, why am I opening this? When you find yourself scrolling, ask, how do I feel after 10 minutes of this? Not while you're watching. After. Do you feel energized, relaxed, inspired, curious, or empty? Angry, insecure, restless, If something consistently leaves you feeling worse, that information matters. You can also create what I would call an attention budget. You already have a time budget. Maybe you plan your work, your gym, your sleep, your study. But what about your attention? Decide what deserves it. Maybe you want 30 minutes of entertainment. Fine. Enjoy it completely. But don't accidentally spend 3 hours consuming things you don't even remember afterward. Maybe you want to learn something. Give it focused attention. Maybe someone you love is talking to you. Put the phone away. Give them your attention. Maybe you're eating. Eat. Maybe you're walking. Walk. Because attention isn't only about what you consume. It's also about whether you're actually present for your own life. And here's another powerful exercise. For the next 7 days, choose one thing you want your mind to become better at noticing. Maybe gratitude. Maybe opportunities. Maybe beauty. Maybe learning. Maybe kindness. Maybe solutions. Maybe health. Maybe creativity. And every day, deliberately look for it. If you choose gratitude, ask, what is already working in my life? If you choose opportunities, what can I do with what I have? If you choose beauty, look at the sky. Notice architecture. Notice music. Notice someone's expression. Notice the small details you normally ignore. If you choose kindness, start noticing the tiny ways people help each other. You're teaching your brain, this matters. And the brain gets better at finding what you've taught it to find. But there's one more thing. Your attention doesn't only shape what you see. It shapes who you become. Because what you repeatedly think about influences what you talk about. What you talk about influences what you do. What you do repeatedly becomes behavior. Behavior becomes habit. Habits influence identity. And identity influences the direction of your life. So it might look like tension, thought, behavior, habit, identity, life. It starts much earlier than you think. Before the decision, before the action, at the level of attention. Think about a person who spends years consuming content about fitness. Eventually they learn exercises. Then they start training. Then training becomes routine. Then they begin seeing themselves as someone who trains. Their identity changes. Now imagine another person spending years consuming content about how terrible their body looks. They don't train. They compare. They criticize themselves. Their attention keeps reinforcing the identity. I'm not attractive. Same internet. Same human brain. Completely different direction. That's why what you consume matters. Not because every video is going to transform you, but because repetition is powerful. And this applies to relationships too. If you repeatedly focus on what your partner does wrong, you'll become very good at finding flaws. If you repeatedly focus on what they do right, you'll notice those things more. That doesn't mean ignoring genuine problems. It means understanding that attention is selective. The same person can become either someone who constantly disappoints me, or someone who has flaws but also does many things I appreciate. Neither perception is necessarily the entire truth. Your attention determines which parts of the truth become psychologically dominant. And this is why relationships can slowly change without anyone changing dramatically. Attention changes. The same thing happens with your own life. Maybe your life isn't perfect. Of course it isn't. But ask yourself, what percentage of your attention is currently directed toward what's wrong? And what percentage goes toward what is working? You may discover something uncomfortable. You don't necessarily have a bad life. You may have a mind trained to inspect your life for evidence that it's bad. And those are different problems. One requires changing circumstances. The other requires changing attention. There is also something beautiful about reclaiming attention. When you stop giving everything away, you start feeling like your mind belongs to you again. You don't immediately react to every notification. You don't need to know every argument happening online. You don't have to absorb every opinion. You don't have to compare yourself every morning. You don't have to know what everyone else is doing. You begin creating empty space. And at first, that space might feel uncomfortable because you've become accustomed to constant stimulation. But eventually something returns. Silence. And inside that silence, you may notice yourself again. Maybe you've forgotten what your own thoughts sound like without the internet speaking over them. Maybe you've forgotten how long you can sit without stimulation. Maybe you've forgotten what boredom feels like. And boredom isn't necessarily a problem. Sometimes boredom is the doorway through which creativity enters. When there is nothing demanding your attention, your mind begins creating. Ideas appear, questions appear, memories appear. You start noticing your surroundings. You start thinking about things that actually matter to you. That's why protecting attention isn't simply about productivity. It's about protecting your inner life. Because at the end of your life, you won't get a receipt showing how many hours you had. You will have a collection of experiences, a collection of moments, a collection of things you noticed, people you listened to, places you looked at, questions you explored, things you cared about. And in a strange way, your life will be the sum of what you paid attention to. So be careful, because attention is not free. Every time you give it away, you are giving away a tiny piece of your life. You don't need to become perfectly disciplined. You don't need to eliminate every distraction. You don't need to meditate for 3 hours. You don't need to live like a monk. Just start noticing. Notice what makes you anxious. Notice what makes you jealous. Notice what makes you curious. Notice what makes you angry. Notice what makes you feel alive. Notice what you automatically reach for when you're uncomfortable. Because your automatic attention reveals something about you. And once you can see the pattern, you can change it. So tonight, before you sleep, ask yourself one question. What did I give my attention to today? Not what did you accomplish? Not how productive were you? Not how successful were you? Just, what did I look at? What did I think about? What conversations occupied my mind? What content did I consume? Who did I compare myself to? What problem did I repeatedly replay? What did I notice? What did I ignore? And then ask the more important question. If I repeated today's attention for the next 5 years, who would I become? That question can change things. Because maybe you wouldn't like the answer. Maybe 5 years of constant comparison would create someone exhausted and insecure. Maybe 5 years of outrage would create someone bitter. Maybe 5 years of distraction would create someone who can't sit with themselves. But maybe 5 years of learning would create someone wise. 5 years of training would create someone strong. 5 years of creating would create something that didn't exist before. 5 years of being present with people you love would create memories you actually remember living. 5 years of protecting your mind might create a completely different person. Your attention is shaping you whether you use it consciously or not. That's the important part. You don't have to control every thought. You don't have to control everything you see. You simply need to understand that repeated attention has consequences. What you repeatedly look at becomes easier to notice. What becomes easier to notice becomes more important to you. What becomes more important to you begins influencing your choices, and your choices eventually become your life. So guard your attention, not because the world is dangerous, but because your mind is impressionable. Don't give every stranger access to your inner world. Don't allow every algorithm to decide what you think about. Don't spend your most valuable mental energy comparing your life to people you've never met. Don't spend hours feeding a version of yourself that you don't even want to become. Choose what enters. Choose what stays. Choose what deserves your attention. Because your attention is not just something you have. It is something you become. And wherever your attention goes, your life slowly follows.